Well, hello and welcome to Working Rangelands Wednesdays, where we explore topics around rangeland agriculture in California and across the West. I'm Leslie Roche, a cooperative extension specialist in rangeland science and management at the University of California, Davis.
And I'm Dan Macon. I'm Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor with UC Cooperative Extension, covering Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties.
And I'm Grace Woodmansee. I'm working on my master's degree at UC Davis, and I'm working with Leslie and Dan as my advisors.
So thank you everyone for joining us on our very first installment of Working Rangelands Days. Today we are talking about rangeland livestock production and drought in California. And we are very excited to kick off the series with Grace Woodmansee, who is a UC Davis graduate student and an incoming Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center fellow. So I'll hand the controls over and take it away, Grace.
All right, thanks, Leslie. Well, I'm excited to be here today to talk to all of you a little bit about part of my thesis research, which is focusing on drought adaptation for rangeland livestock producers. So today I'll be presenting some on-the-ground perspectives from ranchers who lived through California's historic drought in hopes that we can kind of leverage these perspectives into applied solutions for adapting to future droughts. And this project has been a true collaborative effort between myself, Dan, Leslie, and Cooperative Extension Advisor Tracy Shore. So the overall goal of this presentation is to provide insight to what worked and what didn't work for ranchers managing through California's historic drought. So in order to achieve that goal, I'm kind of going to approach it in two different ways by reviewing results from two different studies that our lab group worked on. The first is from 2011 and provides sort of some baseline information about in-place drought management plans that ranchers had before the historic drought hit. And then a follow-up interview effort in 2016 that really provides more of an in-depth look at what strategies worked and didn't work for those ranchers as they managed through such severe conditions. But before I really dig into the data, I wanted to kind of first move my video a little bit. So before getting into the data, I wanted to address a little bit about what rangelands are and what they look like specifically in California. So I think that rangelands are really defined by their diversity, whether that's diversity in forage type or diversity in how society kind of values and uses these landscapes. So in terms of a technical definition, rangeland is defined as uncultivated land that provides the necessities of life for grazing and browsing animals. And these landscapes are uncultivated due to their physical limitations. So in terms of topography or climate or soil quality. So really they're dominated by grasses, either annual grasses or introduced grasses or native grasses in California. However, just because they can't be cultivated doesn't mean that these landscapes aren't extremely important. In fact, just the opposite is true. Rangelands provide numerous environmental and social benefits to our society, including clean water, wildlife habitat, open space, recreation opportunities, and of course, forage for both wild and domestic grazers. And commonly, rangelands are at the nexus of kind of these wildland, agricultural, and urban landscapes. And I think California really showcases that, as over 60% of our state is classified as range. And as I mentioned, California rangelands are a critical source of forage for grazing animals. And in turn, these grazing animals can serve as a management tool to maintain and enhance some of those ecosystem services that we discussed. In California, our rangelands are supporting a $3 billion a year cattle and sheep industry. And implications for that include sort of impacts on rural communities, food security, and our state economy as a whole. Okay, so I briefly wanted to touch on some sort of challenges specific to California rangeland livestock producers that are centered around these 3 points that I have on the screen. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is that California is extremely diverse. It has a range of forage types and a variety of land ownership types that kind of combine to create region-specific drought impacts. Of course, as all of you know, we're operating under a Mediterranean climate in California, and most ranchers have kind of evolved their drought management plans to reflect that Mediterranean climate and the seasonal water shortages that it brings. So kind of drought planning that's specific to addressing challenges brought about by long, hot, dry summers and a variable rainy season. And then finally, we must consider how land management type influences drought management planning. And by land management type, I'm referring to either public or private rangelands. So for example, a drought management plan that a producer would develop to operate on a public leased grazing allotment would probably look a lot different than a drought management plan developed for a privately owned piece of rangeland. I think it's also really important to consider that 20% of livestock producers in California are relying on a combination of both public and private lands to kind of build out their annual forage calendar. So also building drought management plans that kind of address those needs concurrently is also very important. So the severity and duration of California's historic drought, which lasted from about 2012 to 2016, really tested the ability of land managers to adapt under extraordinary conditions. Not only were producers dealing with severe shortages of water, but they were dealing with that, those restrictions over several years. In some cases, up to 6 years in certain parts of California. So I've kind of highlighted that in this series of maps on the right-hand side of your screen that I pulled from the US Drought Monitor. If you'll note, exceptional drought is highlighted in that darkest red color. And during 2014 and 2015, we see that exceptional drought covers over half of the state. So the ability to manage through these kinds of extreme disturbances is really tied to adaptive capacity. And by adaptive capacity, I mean the ability to respond to a disturbance, adjust, and learn through experience. And I think we can all relate to adaptive capacity, whether, maybe outside of drought management planning, but in other aspects of our life as well. But for ranchers trying to survive a drought, adaptive capacity involves managing pressing threats like a lack of forage resources while protecting the long-term economic sustainability of their operation. So that's what this presentation and this research as a whole is really getting at, is adaptive capacity. By better understanding the successes and challenges that ranchers have in managing through historic drought conditions, the more prepared we can all be for the next drought. So our goal in conducting this research is to identify ranch-tested solutions and strategies to share with other ranchers in building their drought management plans, and also to inform research and policy that really is applicable on the ground and at the ranch level. And after about 3 years of average to above average precipitation, we currently find ourselves back in a drought. So we had a very dry, warm February this year, and we're hoping for a miracle March, but the rainfall that arrived in March often came too late to preserve normal forage production on our annual grasslands. And just in talking to ranchers about what they're seeing out on the range this year, I think kind of the centerpiece of the 2020 drought so far has been variability. Some folks aren't seeing much of a difference in the total amount of forage they have out on their rangelands, whereas other people are seeing that they have some really short grass for this time of year. I think the main concern at this point is because the timing of that rainfall, we have kind of reductions in overall forage quality. So even if we do have a lot of forage in some places out on California rangelands, it's probably of lower quality than it should be at this time of year, kind of given these circumstances. So in addition, drought conditions, of course, bring about the challenge of providing stock water throughout the grazing season as well. So folks right now are trying to figure out what next steps they need to take to prepare for summer and fall grazing, given these current drought conditions. So I think understanding how we study drought adaptation helps in kind of interpreting the results that I'm going to present today. So I wanted to touch briefly on what the adaptive decision-making framework is and why we use it. So basically, this framework outlines how ranchers manage through drought, and success in adaptation is kind of dependent on these 4 categories: your information resource network, how you set goals, your management tools, and previous experience with drought. So examples of an information resource network might include your neighbor, your local extension agent, online resources, or even place-based information from multi-generational ranches. Goal setting involves not just what the ranch's priorities are, but who's involved in setting them. And management capacity refers to what tools you have available to solve problems and kind of incorporate flexibility into a drought management plan. So one example of that might be having access to multiple range types to kind of make up your forage base, so that if severe drought impacts really wipe out one of those forage types, you're able to kind of pivot to another one, hopefully without having to buy too much hay or resort to other sort of reactive drought management strategies. And then, of course, experience always shapes future priorities and decisions. For example, and we're going to get into this more later, for those that manage through California's historic drought, they now think about what drought means in general and how their drought management plans are structured because of that experience they went through. So really, adaptation evolves over time as experience continues to shape each one of these components of the framework. And these 4 categories are where research and extension efforts can be concentrated. We can't necessarily get you more drought experience, but we can share the experience of others in hopes that that can provide some solid information for developing an applied drought management plan. Okay, so this schematic just kind of outlines what the 2 data sets I'll be referring to today are and how they fall in relationship to the drought years. So the first is the 2011 survey, which was conducted with the overall goal of assessing management structures, motivations, and values of California ranchers, and also included a drought component. So what we learned from that is a little bit about what in-place drought management strategies folks had before the historic drought hit. And then during the drought years, that kind of that baseline information kind of inspired a lot of questions about how the proactive and reactive strategies that ranchers were using or planned to use actually fared through the drought years. So in 2016, we initiated the second study, this interview effort, to really take a deeper dive into how these drought management strategies were working for folks and why things worked and why things didn't work. And we know from previous work that flexibility is a really important part of managing through drought, and multi-species grazing is one way that producers can incorporate flexibility into a drought management plan. So in the 2016 interview results, we are particularly interested in how multi-species grazing influences flexibility and drought management planning as a whole. Okay, let's get started looking at some of the 2016 interview data. So we interviewed 48 ranchers who were on average age 59, male, and 3rd generation in ranching. However, these responses really captured a diversity of operators throughout the state, with respondents ranging from age 31 to 86, and generations in ranching represented from first generation ranchers all the way up to 7th generation. And these interviews represent 20 cattle operators, 13 multi-species operators, and 15 sheep operators. Okay, so proactive adaptation is management planning done to alleviate some of the effects of drought before it takes place. So this is really an ideal place to start with kind of forward planning, because it helps reduce some of the kind of emergency decision making that you may be faced with in the middle of a drought. So just before I review the results, I'd like to take a second to orient you to our table here. So we have operation type by species listed on the left. So cattle operations on the top, multi-species operations in the middle, and sheep operations on the bottom. I've identified the top 3 proactive practices by species, the percent of interviewed ranchers that use that species, and the average effectiveness of that practice ranked by the interviewed ranchers. And that ranking is on a 1 through 5 Likert scale, 5 being highly effective. So our main takeaway here is that we're seeing kind of similar proactive adaptation practices across operation type, but they're all related to conserving forage. One thing I want to point out is that identifying animals to sell seems to be a proactive practice associated with operations that include sheep, as we're seeing that as a top 3 practice for both multi-species operators and sheep operators. Okay, and because our question is centered around whether or not multi-species grazing adds a layer of flexibility into drought management planning, we wanted to look at that question specifically. So we found that 54% reported that managing multi-species was a part of their proactive management plan. So those are of the multi-species operators that were already in existence before the drought. And we also wanted to look at how adding a class of livestock may also be a way of increasing flexibility. So we actually found that few producers indicated that managing multiple classes fit their operation. So during the interviews, we heard things like, I'm a cow-calf operator, I don't run stockers. So I think this result is kind of interesting because it highlights that for those operators seeking to diversify their operations, they're more inclined to do it by adding an additional species instead of a class of livestock. Okay, getting into reactive practices or drought management strategies that are deployed during the drought. The top 3 strategies ranked across species types are all related to increasing carrying capacity, so practices like purchasing feed, or decreasing stocking rate, things like weaning early and selling animals, which makes a lot of sense because during the drought years, folks were trying to adapt to pretty severe restrictions in forage availability. As you can see, purchasing feed is a top strategy for both beef and sheep producers. And I just want to highlight that these results could be capturing a few different things, not just purchasing hay as an additional reactive strategy. So purchasing feed may also be representing folks that purchase protein supplement to make use of available feed, or people that had already reduced their herd size to sort of a critical mass and needed to provide supplemental feed to their remaining herd. I'd also like to point out that government assistance was identified as a top strategy across operation types, although it was moderately ranked in terms of effectiveness. And that's regardless of how many of these operators received funding. So for example, 100% of cattle operators that applied for government assistance received it, whereas 50% of sheep operators that applied for government assistance received it, and both ranked that practice as moderately effective. So this could be due to a few different things. One, maybe not enough funding was received. 2, maybe the process of applying for government assistance was too intensive, or just the idea of applying for government assistance in general could not be very palatable to the ranchers that ranchers surveyed. And I think sort of the overall takeaway with these reactive practices is that they're more diverse than the proactive practices. And it's a little bit difficult to see that in this chart that's just identifying the top 3 reactive practices by species. So I've included all of the proactive and reactive practices that interviewed ranchers were kind of asked about. And I think it's pretty clear here that there's a greater diversity of reactive practices. Okay, so we're also interested in looking at land resource base as another option to increase flexibility. So we're still looking at this through the lens of operation type to see if there's a difference between the land resource base kind of used by both single and multi-species operators. So when we look at land resource base, we're kind of looking at a couple things. First, the total amount of acreage per operation, which is on the left-hand side of the chart, and that's an average. And then we're also using the map on the right-hand side to classify rangeland type. So each color in that map represents a different forage resource, and that difference is based in sort of changes in topography, climate, and location across California. We're also assuming that as land type or range type increases, so does forage diversity. So we can see that the average acreage per operation ranges from just over 20,000 acres for cattle producers to just under 14,000 acres for sheep producers. We also see some similarities in land type diversity across these operations. So in the middle column, we're looking at land type access by season. So essentially, how many different colors of range does your operation have access to in a given season? And we see the results are pretty similar. Whereas when we move over to land type access throughout the entire year, so to build out an operation's entire forage calendar, we see that operations involving sheep have slightly greater access to a diversity of range type, averaging about 6 across the entire year compared to cattle operations that had about 5 different rangeland types. Okay, so we looked at acreage and range type. Let's take a look briefly at how land ownership type as a proportion of these operations. So regardless of species, kind of both operations are using pretty close to a 50-50 mixture of California private lands, whether they be leased or owned, and federal grazing allotments managed by the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management. So the takeaway here is that land ownership type is not necessarily building flexibility because they're so similar, but we see greater flexibility in range type by operation, with operations involving sheep having a greater diversity of range types involved in their forage calendar, and that's what we looked at on the previous slide. So overall, land resource base between multi-species operators and single species operators is fairly similar. Where we're really seeing differences between how these different operation types manage through drought is in the proactive and reactive drought management strategies that they're using. Okay, so finally, these last 2 slides are going to compare pre and post-drought perspectives based on our 2011 survey results and our 2016 interview results. So this first question is kind of getting at managing through, getting at the fact that managing through the historic drought appears to have made drought planning a bigger priority for respondents. And in the second question, we're seeing that those that manage through the historic drought see the next drought as less of a threat to the economic viability of their operation. And we don't know if that's due to respondents feeling like they gained more insight and kind of bolstered their adaptive capacity by managing through California's historic drought, or if the drought was so bad that it's difficult to imagine kind of subsequent droughts bringing about those types of severe challenges. So both of these responses indicate that experience with drought makes a difference. And if you remember from the beginning of the presentation, experience with drought was one of the components of the adaptive decision-making framework that was really influential in drought management planning and adaptive capacity over time. And these results are aligning with that assumption. Okay, and then we can see here that self-reported drought management planning was consistent between those pre and post-drought assessments, with just over half of respondents reporting that they had a drought management plan in place heading into California's historic drought. However, when we break this out by species, we do see some differences. So operations that included sheep, both multi-species producers and sheep producers, the majority of those operations had a drought management plan in place, whereas 35% of cattle operators reported having a drought management plan in place heading into the historic drought. So kind of wrapping up here with some key findings, we found more consistent proactive management strategies across operation types that were kind of focused on conservative stocking. Reactive strategies tended to be more diverse and were focused on rebalancing kind of that forage supply and demand during drought years. And then overall, we're seeing that multi-species grazing can increase flexibility, but of course also adds a layer of complexity to management. So operation goals and management capacity have to be aligned in order to make adding in additional species kind of a proactive strategy that will work well. But in terms of kind of evidence that we saw of that strategy being useful, 54% of those who used it ranked it as highly effective in terms of being a proactive drought management strategy. And then we also saw that multi-species operations were using a greater diversity of forage resources, which also offers more flexibility in a drought management plan. So what is kind of the take-home message here? I thought it'd be most useful to kind of break out what our take-home is at 3 different levels: at the ranch level, the community level, and the policy level. So if you're a rancher interested in adding an additional species to your operation as a proactive drought management strategy, we have a variety of resources available to help you kind of start that process. And I'll share those resources on the next slide. Dan Macon also has done a lot of work to support multi-species grazers as a part of his cooperative extension program, so he's also an excellent resource. At the community level, I think the question is really, how do we work together as a network of support agencies, researchers, and ranchers to prepare for the next drought and hopefully adapt to it better by kind of leveraging this knowledge we've gained from California's historic drought. And I think it's important to highlight 2 things we know from previous research. 1, ranchers learn best from other ranchers, so peer networks are really important. And 2, boundary spanning organizations that work directly with ranchers play a really important role as a trusted source of information and in information sharing. So I think the key is developing these networks to make sure that we're getting applied ranch tested solutions and strategies out to the ranch managers that need them. And at the policy level, our work adds to the growing body of literature that emphasizes that drought plans can never be one size fits all, and that policy must be designed to support the region-specific impacts of drought and also kind of speak to the individual goals and characteristics of ranching operations. So supporting flexibility in management will help to build both ranch and range resilience. And with that, I would like to share some of those resources that I mentioned. If you have any questions, of course, I'd be happy to take some now, but I've also included my contact information at the bottom.
All right. Well, Grace, thank you very much. Very well done. Very well done. And we do have a few questions coming in here. I think we'll start with a question that came in about dietary overlap between cattle and sheep on California rangelands, and whether there's been any research into that dietary overlap. And that might be something for Leslie to take on too. Are you aware of any of that research, Leslie?
Oh, sorry. So about dietary overlap, I mean, broadly, yeah, there has been work, looking at browsing versus grazing, in the West in general. Sounds like Grace is shaking her head. Maybe she has something to add.
No, just agreeing. Please continue.
But there's a lot of folks in California, and this is a bit of a loaded question because I know Dan has his own answer. That have been using, mixed species and targeted grazing programs, and there's been work out of Utah showing that you can, while there is some differences in diet and forage preferences, you can also condition animals over time and use them in targeted grazing type scenarios.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that I would add to that question is there was some research done in Idaho maybe 10 years or so ago that looked at weight gains in stocker cattle and in yearling ewes, and found actually that where there was mixed species grazing, both species actually did better under similar conditions, which would suggest that perhaps there is some complementary element to that multi-species grazing as well. I think it'd be interesting to look at that on annual rangelands, because we'd have very different forage types, obviously, than Idaho would have. We had another question from John Harper about whether the drought management plans that we looked at included a wildfire component. And we asked about wildfire being an impact. We did not necessarily ask in this round of interviews about wildfire planning. And it's certainly related to the larger question of kind of disaster planning for ranches. But it'd be interesting if you either of you talked to anybody that's done any of that kind of work for their own ranches, Leslie or Grace.
No, I haven't specifically, but I think that is a really valuable area that this type of research can be kind of expanded into. I think it would be particularly helpful to kind of also capture some of the applied on-ranch kind of tested solutions in terms of wildfire planning, because I know that's kind of another very region-specific impact that affects every operation differently. So I think that's definitely a place where this research could be expanded into in the future for sure.
Well, and I think we are hearing in some of these interviews and from folks since then about the sort of the interactions of drought and bad years and good years, and fuels management issues. So if we have really productive years with a lot of growth and the next year is drought, then that's deadly fuel, essentially. So then I think, some of what we heard was that folks were seeing an increase in severity of impacts from wildfire following, dealing with severe drought conditions.
Mm-hmm. I think one other thing I would add, Leslie, your comment reminded me of this is, and this is something I've talked to Dan quite a bit about, but I think also the idea of balancing conserving forage as a part of your drought management plan and kind of weighing that with what it does in terms of increasing your wildfire risk is particularly tricky. Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Grace. I think there is definitely a tension between conserving fall forage and reducing fire danger at the point at which we seem to have our most intense wildfires in California. I think the other element to this, which would be interesting to look at from an information and kind of planning perspective, is the time horizon at which you can plan for certain types of disasters. So a drought is a very long-term plan that allows for a fair bit of proactive work, whereas a wildfire, there is some proactive work that can be done, but you have very little time to respond typically in those kinds of conditions. And I think there's some opportunities for us to help people kind of grapple with those differences. Any other questions from our audience? I think we've asked the questions that were on. Oh, here we go. We've is there a resource that we can use to estimate startup costs in adding sheep to an existing cow-calf operation that includes sheep, fencing, etc.? I think your local farm advisor is a good resource for a lot of that. There are some fairly dated cost studies that were done by the Ag Issues Center on sheep production, and I think that's an area where we could certainly do some updates to some of that kind of work. Some of the courses that I teach here locally in the foothills also include an economic component that look at the capital cost and kind of what you can expect in terms of operating costs. But I would definitely tap into local resources for some of that as well. Leslie or Grace, would you add anything there?
I mean, yeah, just what you said about I was thinking about that too, those cost studies. That might be something that, Extension can look into and updating as well. I know you also have your business management, farm management classes, Dan.
Right.
I think Gracie shared some of those that, could be really valuable. Because that's the one point I thought was really surprising about the results here was that folks that were looking to diversify weren't particularly thinking about adding classes of animals, but whole different species of animals. And that's quite a big jump into a whole new, enterprise commodity, have you. And I think that's a really good question. That's one of the things that jumped out at me too, was how do folks even get started in doing that? And the folks that we talked to, obviously we're using their peer networks and local extension. But I think that is something that we could look into potentially pursuing with some of our, economist collaborators.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other piece to that question, maybe an example here locally, we've got a group here in the foothills that is kind of rancher driven and rancher led, and it is multi-species. There are cattle producers, sheep producers, and goat producers in this group. And that's been a really effective way to get people to talk and kind of cross-pollinate ideas about not only multi-species, but alternative forage resources and some of those other strategies that can be helpful. Those peer-to-peer networks, I think, are really important, as you suggested, Grace. We have a question here about whether respondents included increasing soil moisture holding capacity through increased organic matter in the soil, and then also whether there were age differences for the methods tried. And I assume that means were older ranchers more likely to try specific practices versus younger producers. Grace, do you have any sense of that from looking at the data?
Yeah, I think that second question is a great one. And now I'm really interested in going back and kind of seeing if we can parse that out. That's not something we've looked at yet, but I think that there's a really good opportunity to do that, especially given that we had that diversity of ranch managers kind of captured in this interview data. Like I mentioned, ranch managers ranged from age 31 to 87 and had were coming from between 1 and 7 years in terms of generations in ranching. So I think that could offer some really good information to people that might be able to kind of be layered into a cost analysis of what it would cost associated with adding an additional species or that kind of adaptation as well.
Well, and I would just add that we also know with some of the work that we've done with young first generation ranchers is, there's some of those startup cost limitations. And so there's definitely, in terms of operation structure and things that they're trying are, very different from the more traditional multi-generational operations, which have, different and greater availability of resources. And I think, in particular, thinking about some of the, method differences, some of these folks that are, are younger, and, I'm also layering on, and, just getting into the business, kind of have to do different things, to break in. And so we know there's some differences that way, but I agree, we could dig in a bit into this data set and see if we're seeing that there as well, just looking at age and generation separately. And then the soil moisture question, interested to see what you think, Grace, or your sense of looking at the data. We do know that previously, in general, just soil health has been ranked very highly in terms of goals for the operation among California ranchers. And I would say, that was from some survey data that we had, before the whole soil health renaissance, really. So that was back in 2011. And so, ranchers are definitely we're already thinking about soil health and how that connected to forage productivity and supporting livestock production on their operation. But I don't quite remember, Grace, what was your sense with this particular recent set?
Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember any questions that specifically got at increasing soil moisture, holding capacity through increasing organic matter. But I think, Leslie, you're right that there are a couple other questions about management goals and priorities and structure that might be able to help kind of hint at that as kind of an individual operation goal. I don't know, Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, we did not identify that as a particular tool in terms of drought preparation strategies. We did ask if there were tools that we hadn't listed in the survey, and that didn't come up in the interviews as folks went through those. I think indirectly there are some things in those drought preparation strategies that contribute to building organic matter. So things like stockpiling forage or resting pastures may contribute to the buildup of organic matter in some of those systems. And I think it's also important to note that we were looking some of the operations that we looked at had both irrigated pasture and rangeland as part of their forage calendars. And so there may have been some differences there as well. So we've got a question about how UC Rangelands is taking this data to assist ranchers through trainings and guiding on the ground future research. That may be a good question to kind of end on. How do we take this and actually get it into people's hands? Grace, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my first thought kind of relates back to the community level kind of take-home message that I ended on, which is I think we really have to work together, ranchers, researchers, support agencies, to figure out ways to get this information into the hands of people that need it. And for me, I think that starts by kind of going to communities and giving presentations of the data in a way that's applicable for what their situation is. But I'd also be super interested in getting feedback on what we are presenting with this data set, and kind of guiding future research by using that feedback and what people want more information on. And in general, like what people are thinking about how this can apply to their individual operations, because I think it's a little tricky with the amount of diversity we see in ranching and rangelands throughout California to kind of come up with one approach to this. But I think that's kind of the beauty of having support organizations that have community connections with their ranchers, so that they can figure out ways of packaging this information that works best for the producers that they're serving. So I would start there, and I would also be really interested in hearing more about rancher priorities and how we can kind of push forward this research given those priorities.
And I would just add to that, I think one of the things that we're looking at from a research perspective is whether or not early weaning is a tool that fits on annual rangelands. It's a tool that is highly recommended in more perennial systems, But we have a very different management system here on our annual rangelands, where early weaning may or may not have some economic benefit as a drought response tool. I think the other element that this really helped me understand and realize going forward is that there is a need to kind of provide some psychological, emotional support for people as they're grappling with these decisions. So they're not easy decisions. They represent significant changes to sell livestock or to reduce the size of an operation in some cases that perhaps are several generations old. And I think those kinds of community support networks are really important. The technical and economic aspects of it are important, but so are the support for making some of those tough decisions. Leslie, what are your thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. And I'm also thinking, we are, everybody's working in a very much changing landscape. Thinking about how future experiences will likely not be anything like our past experiences. And right now, what we're all dealing with right now in the current situation with the global pandemic, this is all sort of new landscape for us as well. And just thinking about how, in terms of like Grace was talking about, like adaptive capacity, how folks are going to cope with and adapt with these rapidly evolving and changing conditions. And, some of the things we asked folks about that, Grace didn't get to, but we also asked folks about their climate change perspectives. And across the board, sheep and beef producers are, really interested in learning more about, how that's going to affect their operations moving forward. And, and how are they going to manage for long-term severe natural hazards like drought, and then of course like fire as well. And so just thinking about, as us as an extension organization, how are we going to evolve and make sure that we are meeting those needs? And this webinar series that we've all started actually came out of a Renewable Resources and Extension Act grant, where we were going to do some hands-on, on the ground drought planning with folks, and really think about what folks are doing now. What have they been doing now that's different from the past, and how do we move forward? So we had to retool a little bit given the current situation, but that is something that's also on my mind about how we can help folks in developing for them useful and worth their time in terms of drought management plans.
And that's actually a great segue for talking about our next Wednesday webinar on Wednesday, May 20th. We will further this conversation with a panel discussion with 3 ranchers, one who's a cattle producer, one who is a multi-species producer, and one who is a first-generation sheep producer, that will really help look at kind of where those differences are between 2020 and the 2011 to 15 drought, and where some of their research and learning needs might lie. So I encourage you to think about joining us again on May 20th, 1 o'clock. I don't see any more questions. I think we can wrap this up. Grace, thank you. Outstanding job. And Leslie, do you have any final words for us?
I thank everyone for joining us. And like Dan said, I hope we see you all again next time. And just a reminder that we will be posting, all of our Working Rangelands Wednesdays recordings on our UC Rangelands YouTube channel. So be sure to check that out as well. And thank you, everyone, and goodbye. Have a good week.
Yeah, thank you all.